right. Let me get it. Got my screens together. All right, so let's go in. Let's talk about this here. Let's talk about it. See, we got nationality being destroyed. Nationality being destroyed. There being a forced displacement in the persecution, and there being a type of citizenship or nationality that doesn't incorporate the same aspects and protections, and this is legally documented. So we want to go in, we want to go deep. So here, let's look at it here. Okay, so nationality destroyed. Okay, so black people possess nationality and political identity before American slavery, which was systematically dismantled rather than lawfully transferred. Okay, so this nationality was directly intended to be, how do I say, put aside, for you not to carry it over, for them not to go into, hey, what was your nationality? You know, your culture, spirituality, language, ancestry, anything of that nature before slavery. Now that you are free, this was by design. So this forced displacement and persecution, this was kind of a default to that. So American slavery and its legal aftermath constituted forced displacement akin to what we call refugee conditions. So when you are classified as a refugee, you are pretty much displaced or kicked out, separated from your native land, and you can't return back to your native land and operate as a government without facing persecution. So if you think about the circumstances that the so-called Black Americans were in before slavery, it was relative to warfare in a lot of senses. So, um, if you, how could you go back to a land in which you were being gathered into slavery? So you couldn't go back into that land because in that land, other so-called African tribes, actual African tribes, were gathering the so-called blacks and enslaving them, selling them, trading them with the Europeans, and then so thus you have the transatlantic. So in that regard, they would be classified as refugees, unable to return back to their land. Now, this is the key to freedom, because once black stars are tapping back into their original nationality, they will be able to represent their nation based on their nationality as they're seeking refuge from being exiled from that nation. They can then go to seek to rebuild that nation and establish a type of ambassadorship, which is an acknowledgement and separation in jurisdiction. But we're going to go deeper into that. We're going to go deeper. Okay, so the law provided um, a label of citizenship, like what is that legal maxim? What is similar is not the same. So when we go into that regard, what is similar is not the same. So like it's a type, like, all right, well, what's functional? And this is what came with the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was 100% made in response to freed slaves. And it created a national citizenship or a national aspect of nationality when there was no nationality relative to the unified 50 states. Each state provided its own citizenship or nationality. You were a state national of whichever state. So there was no real nationality at the time until the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was, in a sense, trying to originally equal the playing field, but people don't know the history behind what actually happened. So let's go in and discuss it. So now let's look at nationality before slavery. What was destroyed specifically? So the so-called black people being, rounded up and gathered into slavery. They already had a social organization, a distinct nationality and political identity, status, and point of views. The only barrier there was a sense of language, which, when being diplomatic, is not a real barrier. It's a barrier to be easily overcome. which is what diplomatics is about. So nobody was interested again in finding out and reestablishing or restoring us. It was never about we're going to restore you for the purposes of aggregation. It was all about, hey, we're going to dismantle you for the purposes of assimilation. Because through that assimilation, that workforce, there was power and advancement. So nobody was thinking about, hey, well, go do your own thing now that you're free. It was, hey, come join us and forget who you were before you were in this situation. So that is an issue. That indeed is an issue. So now let's look at denationalization as a legal act and how slavery reclassified Africans as property, Africans being the so-called Black Americans in this sense, claiming legal personality and creating a statelessness without substitution. Okay, so this legal denationalization is really just an act of stripping the individual of their political identity without a lawful transfer or consent. So, and this went into the aspects of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Atlantic slave system, Atlantic slave trade reclassified the so-called Africans that were coming over in slavery as property, which in a sense eliminated all legal personality entirely. So if you're classified as property, you have to be classified as like human first before you could even be classified as representing the nation. So that, you know, we were layers away from just simply, oh, okay, well, you were a slave, now you're a free man. It was like, oh, you were property and not fully human, and now you're free. But we still don't fully look at you as equal or human. So when the guards of restoring nationality, it was never considered. But again, this was by design. Even if it was considered, the idea was quickly scrapped. All right, because that would not maintain the power structure. Okay, so slavery did not encounter stateless persons. It created stateless persons by force. So think of you released from slavery, and just to sum it up, it's almost like a felony to be homeless. Well, what am I supposed to do? I don't have nowhere to live. You know, I'm free from the plantation. Where do I go? Oh, well, it's a felony to be homeless. Well, I don't have my own home. I was forced over here, brought over here to this country in a sense. Okay, so you immediately say, hey, look, as soon as you're free, you in violation of the law. So now you got to go back into slavery or sign some new type of contract. There was never a sense of restoration. So when they were free, they were stateless. Like, hey, you like a vagabond, like a bum, like a wanderer in the country. And simply being a wanderer in the country is illegal. So you have two options, not three. You either stay a wanderer, which is punishable and is a criminal offense, or you assimilate with us. But the third option of returning or restoring or, aggregating in any way, shape, form, or fashion was not the case, because again, that wouldn't maintain the power structure. So the whole act of assimilation was never to really restore us respect. It was a act of use Black people, for their labor force and their desire and a drive to survive, not be homeless, not be hungry, not to use their desire to work, to provide, to survive, as a economic engine for expansion. All right, so we go to Dred Scott versus Sanford. This happened in 1857, where the Supreme Court ruled that persons of African descent, specifically the so-called Blacks, just so you know, there are two aspects of that: African descent, actual Africans, and then us going Blacks, coming from Africa. We have the Supreme Court ruled that persons of African descent were not and could not become citizens, effectively annulling African nationality without substitution. So again, this is a legal act. Or, well, if we're not citizens and could not become citizens, what are we? We just what status do we obtain to represent us? It's like we're, again, not human, not a man, not able to obtain rights and recognition as a man, a living person in this regard. in this regard. So no national, so you can't join us, and we're not considering the fact that you had your own nation, because we look at you like proper. We look at you like that's like that was no nation for us to acknowledge in some sense, when there were huge empires with every aspect of social running, from sanitation to engineers, blacksmiths, architect, every profession, the whole huge kingdoms going with all types of professions and way of lives, markets, hospital, the whole aspect of in that regard. But no, we're not going to consider the fact that you literally come from an established, organized kingdom being just a different political structure for a nation. That's all. So what happened here? Why were we left hanging? If we're not considered to be able to assimilate, then we should be able to restore ourselves. If this isn't our home, then let us gather ourselves together and rebuild our own home. Hey, if you brought us over here and made it a huge inconvenience to return, mind you, we can't return without facing political persecution, because how are we going to go back to Israel? Or how are we even going to go back to Africa when the Africans, when we were there, sold us into slavery? So, what do you think we're going to go back and reclaim our land without facing some sort of similar opposition? Okay, so we are now here in America seeking refuge. We're just seeking asylum while our government is in exile, since we are disbanded after being released from slavery. Okay, so that is that concept. Now, many, how I say, many folks can't really they can't really understand what it means to how do I say, consider themselves as a refugee. People think this is like some aspect of like being an immigrant or like not belonging. But this is just a sense of waking up, because you just have to realize like, hey, you don't belong. Okay, you don't belong. This has never been a place in which you have belonged in that sense. So claiming to be a refugee or saying I don't belong is just a mental thing, because it makes a person slightly uncomfortable, thinking like, okay, well, I can be kicked out, but sent where? Remember, your government's been disbanded, so this would make you similar or equivalent to like the natives, like in some aspect indigenous to the land, although you're not originally from here, just seeking refuge or asylum, not being a part of society and civilization, but being here is like being a part of the land, or indigenous, not in the society, but here in the world, but not of the world, as we would say. So, in this regard, it is very logical to realize, like, okay, but then again, we still got to get this 14th Amendment, because folks will be like, but no, we were assimilated, right? Destroyed in another sense. In order to assimilate you, you have to destroy the old you in order to come on in, so you can blend, so you can mix. Because if the old you didn't tolerate aspects of mixing, well, you may not be good for assimilation. You may not be politically correct. You may not be socially fit. All right, so now let's look at this slavery as forced displacement and persecution. So we run over this real quick. So we got involuntary removal, permanent separation, prohibition on return, unable to return, you can't come back, and erasure of identity. So the involuntary removal, millions of Africans were forcibly abducted from their homeland, severing ties to established communities. This was not migration, but violent uprooting. Then the passage ensured a near total separation from their country's origin, with no possibility of return for most enslaved Africans. How do we go back? There's governments who've taken over the lands in which we were occupying when we were a government. And should we say, hey, we were here forced, you have to leave? That's almost a sense of an act of war. So, like, what do we do? Prohibition on return, laws and societal structures actively prevented enslaved Africans and their descendants from returning to their ancestral lands. Okay. How? Are you going to give us boats to go back and the provision and so forth? And you would have to do this in droves, not just for the original Africans brought over here, but for all the families and descendants that came from them. Because the original people that got off the boat had children, and them folks had children, and them folks had children. And by the time it came time to release us from slavery, there's at least 3 generations. And, we had dozens of babies. So now you got to send everybody back and provide the means for safe travel and so forth. This was very, very expensive, and not beneficial for the power structure. So this was relative to, okay, so let's just erase their identity because it's far too expensive to restore their identity. Let's erase their identity and have them rebuild it, or we just say replace it. That would be even better. Replace it with, an American point of view. So this is why this aspect of being a refugee is not only logically considered, but when we look at deductive reasoning, it's the truth. Okay, it is the truth. Oh no, there was something else I wanted to touch on right there. Okay, so race-based heredity slavery inflicted several physical and psychological and economic harm based solely on racial identity. So I wanted to touch on this because race and racial identity was fully classified after slaves were released to create working classes. So the whites were a working class that had a little more benefits and privileges than the blacks in the working class, because before this class system was set up, guess what was going on? Black people and white people was joining together and like protesting and having little small riots and revolts at the factory, so forth, saying, hey, we all getting treated bad. We all need to be equal wages, right? So forth, so on. And they said, hey, we can't have this. Let's go ahead and give the white people a little more privileges than the blacks. So we separate that so that they don't complain and unify together. And then it's like, hey, I don't want to complain and mess up my privilege. And then it's like, hey, they're better. They're not helping. Then you have that division right there. That was intended. All right. But the division wasn't necessarily wasn't a big deal until it started messing with the profits. It's all about the money. So then start messing with the money when the workers is like, okay, like, hey, look, like, we're all getting screwed. We all want rights. It's like, okay, well, let's go ahead and split this band up. All right. So that is that in a nutshell without going deep into that history. We can do that another time because that is deep understanding of unified oppression. It was even the same way when we like consider what was that, like slavery, when you had white people who were indentured servants on the plantation, but not subject to the same treatment, hours, workload, etc. But they were there together. So in that sense of, hey, we want to always create that separation so there's not a revolt. So people appreciate their privilege and not revolt, when they see what they could be getting. Well, I could be in that aspect, so I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm happy with what I am getting. So that's kind of how psychologically they did that. Okay, so just wanted to touch on that. All right, let's go on back in. Okay, so the state as an engine of harm. All right, how American legal systems enforced bondage and made violence against Black people lawful or unredressable. So we're just not going to talk about it. All right, so we go in and we see an American slavery system. The state was not merely failing to protect Black people, it was the primary architect and enforcer of their persecution and forced displacement. So in this aspect, the state was not right. So then okay, I don't want to blow it. I don't want to blow it because I'm about to give the full shebang on the 14th Amendment. Wait a second. So, okay, so the state was always oppressive. So would it be wise to allow the state to kind of dictate the rights of citizens or people they never really treated or tolerated as citizens. Because you act like the new people came into office when the laws changed. So these people's mindsets were still towards, hey, black people are property. Even though the federal government are saying they have rights, it's like, I personally believe, my personal views, how I was raised, when we sit at the dinner table, what we talk about, hey, so in this regard, it's like, all right, we're going to not do enough so the boss doesn't come down on us, but we're going to express ourselves and what we want to uphold, the ideals we want to uphold. Okay, so the law enforced bondage. Slave codes actively codified and enforced the institution of slavery, transforming human beings into chattel property with no legal standing. That was the court's view. Courts recognized property claims. Judicial systems upheld the property rights of enslavers, saying that, right, these are people aren't human. All right, so then you got violence was lawful or unredressable. So it was either okay or just not talked about. Then the state as the engine of harm is like the token. The state was not merely failing to protect, it was the primary architect. Okay. The primary architect. All right. So it was making refuge impossible within its borders, which is why there was a need for a 14th Amendment or a federal citizenship type of, so to speak, because the states, was being mean with their citizenship, or in a sense, not providing it. So let's go in and we see, okay, refugee law. Let's look at the definition, the logic, and the geographic objection here. Okay, so the technical definition is persons outside their country or nationality or habitual residence, even if stateless, has a well-founded fear of persecution upon return and cannot rely upon state protection in the area or land in which they would be occupying. Okay, so substantive logic is this forced displacement across the Atlantic left them stateless by design, nationality, race, and therefore that persecution, if they return, would leave them seeking refuge or asylum in the land in which they was released from slavery. Okay, so it'll be very, very hard to like consider, okay, they back in the land and the land is like, how we say, nice to them now. Just they weren't released from slavery in that regard. That wasn't the aim. Okay, it was a power aspect, but we're not focused on that. Just more so the status and what will qualify them as refugees. Okay, so most Black Americans today do not meet the outside country requirement. This technically reveals a historical gap in the refugee law itself, which was drafted after slavery and colonialism. So people, they're not saying, okay, well, the Black people, they're part of this country. They're not refugees. But even in a sense of seeking refuge from the states by the federal government makes them refugees by default because they didn't have state acceptance. So we have had layers to view this, but no matter how you view it, the Blacks were not assimilated or accepted into society in the same degree. The assimilation that did happen was really for profitability, not for their rights or equal treatment in any of that regard. And therefore, they were only left to seek refuge, to seek asylum, seek safety, just try to survive. That was it. That was all. So are we state nationals? Is America our country? Is America the country of your origin? Are you a state national of this place in this regard? Or are you just seeking refuge, surviving in an area where you're never really accepted? Okay, so the promise and failure of Reconstruction. All right, so there was promises, there was, we're going to try to give you guys rights, all right, and give you guys, equal footing here, so you can strap up your bootstraps, lace up your bootstrap, get out, and get to it, and you got the same opportunity as everyone else. Let's see if this was the case. So they promised Civil Rights Act in 1866. This declared all persons born in the United States and not subject to a foreign power as citizens, to explicitly try to repudiate the Dred Scott case. All right, so but the Supreme Court upheld it. All right, but constitutional citizenship in 1868, which was the 14th Amendment, This prevented the states from saying that black people didn't have rights in a sense. So this constitutionalized citizenship status to prevent reversal and granting national citizenship to all persons born or nationalized in the United States to try to override being born or nationalized in the state because the states in and of themselves were being mean. Okay, so the intended outcome was to resolve the profound issue of denationalization and establish black people as, being protected and a part of this society. But this was, again, a ploy, a scheme for the accumulation of a huge labor force and never for the restoration of rights. So we go deeper because the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, see, just right after the 1966 and 1968, 1873 slaughtered the slaughterhouse cases, slaughtered the Civil Rights Acts and the 14th Amendment. Okay, so the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 critically undermined the protective force of the 14th Amendment by distinguishing between state and national citizenship. So when they distinguished between state and national citizenship, they said, okay, so what is protected, what is provided, what rights is granted under national citizenship, and it looked night and day in comparison to what was provided in state citizenship. And this is why black people experience a different type of oppression and force and effectiveness in the legal system because they literally have a different legal classification in America. You aren't the same type of citizen in this regard as the intended citizens. I mean, you can look up Bovier's Law Dictionary, etc. But again, that's another type. We're really just locking in on the refugee aspect of black people. So it hollowed out the citizenship as it really, really limited the details. So national citizenship was stripped of its power to safeguard fundamental civil rights against state infringement, returning control over black Americans' lives to the states. Okay. It hollowed it out greatly and it stripped the power away, the details and and so this resulted in black Americans. They became citizens in form, but refugees in function. And because they were never actually given the benefits and protections of refugees, meaning they lack protection from state oppression and violence, because the state is looking at them as a different classification of citizen. When you go into the depth of citizens, they are citizens, they are considered to have a nationality, but it's national nationality and not the direct intended state nationality. Or even if we say, well, it is state nationality, but it's state nationality that's conferred and based upon the national nationality that has been provided through the 14th Amendment and not the state nationality that was intended. So you have two different types of nationalities, or you go deeper if we try to modernize it and say you have two different types of state nationalities. All right, you have the intended state nationality, and then you have the subjective state nationality. Or we go deeper, you have the intended citizen of United States nationality, and then you have the additive, the artificial version, the seedless version. You had a seedless version, the man-made version, the one that don't really have no force, no power, no effect. And that is what we're dealing with. So do we stay with this status, or do we go to the true status that we should have and get that deep international protection and those international rights from that perspective to represent our own nation? So now this is what we're talking about. This is what we want. This is logical. All right. Okay, so let's go deeper. Okay, so the slaughterhouse case of 1873 split citizenship into state versus national. So that's what I mean by intended versus this additive. Whichever terminology you may want to use based on how you're perceiving the development of law, no problem. It's still two different versions. And one is limited and the other has, intended rights. Then we go to the Cruikshank The Cruikshank cases of 1876 limited federal power to protect or prosecute civil rights. So even though the feds gave the nationality, the Cruikshank cases came back and the feds was like, hey, we're not getting involved in things unless you like go through the state who was already oppressive. So the limited federal power to prosecute civil rights issues and violations of the 14th Amendment. It only applied to the state, and actions of the federal government was impotent against that private racial violence within the state, because the state had the right to oversee the issues first, and they were already corrupt. So what was the point? Now you see how we were literally put back into a state slavery. So now the legislators, the people in government in power in this regard, is profiting off of our labor and still subjugating us to second class rights in this aspect. Okay, so that's the depth of it. Now, we know about civil rights cases. Declare Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional, and Congress lacked authority to prohibit private discrimination or sanction private racial segregation and discrimination issues before the state. So the feds can't get involved directly. Not directly, not without trying to exhaust some sort of state remedy. It has to be it has to go deep. It has to be some sort of clear violation of the Constitution in order to go directly federal. Okay, so I ain't want to go too far. That's my little alarm. I only got one more slide. We got Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Okay, so this is constitutional racial segregation, provided legal justification for Jim Crow. And it reinforced second class citizenship in this aspect. So you either are citizenship informed, you got some sort of weird version of almost a citizen, you similar but not exactly the same, or you actually go into the depth and the truth and say, you know what, I'm not a part of this society. I'm just seeking refuge, asylum. This society was not structured, built for me. It was actually structured and built to exploit me. And it has always been systematically restructured to maintain that exploitation power. I'm not down. So Black Americans were rendered citizens without refuge, a condition that aligns with the logic of refugee protection, even as does not fit in the post-war administrative definition, which, well, came after the 14th Amendment, where they already tried to assimilate Black people. So they were very crafty in the timing of the laws. Okay, so the law resolved the label of citizenship, but never cured the injury of statelessness and persecution. The condition creates a persistent state of internal exile where Black Americans were citizens in form, but functionally resemble refugees, exposed to the very states that had previously enslaved them. And this is all I wanted folks to see, that your remedy would be in the classification as a refugee, because when you're classified as a refugee, you're classified as the representative of another nation, and that nation being in exile needs to be rebuilt. And if you go through the process of lawfully establishing the foundation for rebuilding your nation, then you're no longer a refugee representing that nation, but are now an ambassador representing that nation. And as an ambassador, you have a different type of status, rights, privileges, immunities, exemptions, things of that nature. And this would go, what was that? This would correspond, I believe, to 2 Corinthians 5:20, where it says you are ambassadors of Christ. So if we're talking about as above, so below, we're talking about restoring our kingdom. Maybe this has some sort of correlation. All right, I ain't want to go too far. We at 35. All right, y'all. So I just want to put that on your mind. Drop them jewels in your crown, and perceiving yourself as, okay, well, I've been seeking refuge, and to go from seeking refuge to rebuilding, because in going from seeking refuge to rebuilding, you find the remedy of freedom. See y'all on the next one.